The county record books hidden inside a bent cedar cabinet show a quiet pattern that seems too perfect to be real. Every Vance woman born in the hills past Boone is written down as dying during childbirth on the night before her 19th birthday. Nothing in those official lines suggests something bad happened on purpose, but the matching details feel planned rather than sad. The story begins with those record books written by hand by clerks who probably never thought their everyday work would one day bring up far darker questions. Saved on old paper, the entries describe births in rough mountain cabins and deaths written down with simple language. Each note has the same reason, listed over and over as problems during childbirth. No government worker ever stopped long enough to wonder why these tragedies all happened at the same age. The silence in the records feels almost rehearsed. History experts who later looked at the papers were surprised by how little difference appeared in the descriptions. In an area where medical help was hard to get, childbirth was clearly dangerous. But the Vance pattern does not look like broader country death rates. It looks like something closer to a ritual timeline or an unspoken rule. The repeated wording creates a sense of practiced familiarity, as though the clerk wrote it without needing to ask for more details. To understand why this single family carried such a heavy history, one must first look at the land that sheltered them. The Vance homestead sat deep in a valley that stayed isolated through much of the early 1900s. The path leading in wound through steep ridges where storms easily washed away travel routes. Outsiders rarely visited, and those who did often described the place as strangely quiet. Even the birds seemed to keep their distance at times. The Vances lived in a group of cabins built from rough wood and set above a creek that swelled whenever heavy rain struck the mountains. According to the stories passed among old residents of Watauga County, the family valued privacy beyond anything else. They farmed the slopes and took care of their own business, rarely trading with their scattered neighbors. Many families of that time lived with similar independence, but the Vances seemed committed to keeping distance, as if secrecy itself offered protection. Beyond the homestead, very little remains in the public record. A few tax papers list modest livestock and small harvests. Occasional mentions appear in church lists, though none of the Vance women stayed long. Their names drift in and out of attendance logs like faint echoes of lives cut short. When researchers traced the family trees, they noted that none of the women survived past late teenage years. Every branch of the family tree ended suddenly, replaced only by another infant delivered and then raised under the same quiet roof. The absence of formal medical help during these births contributed to the assumptions that the deaths reflected unfortunate but natural outcomes. At the time, few questioned a midwife's power over country deliveries. The region lacked doctors and many families relied on the same experienced woman for every birth. In the Vance Hollow, that power belonged to the matriarch known simply as Granny Ma. The record books themselves do not mention her name. Yet each entry shadows her presence. For generations she oversaw every delivery, attending to mothers who trusted her without hesitation. Or perhaps they had no choice. In a place bound by tradition and distance, power could last unchallenged for decades. When modern researchers began connecting the patterns, the image that formed was not of an unfortunate family touched over and over by misfortune. Instead, it looked like a closed system where one individual shaped every outcome. These early findings would become the foundation for a deeper investigation into the truth behind the Vance women and the hidden forces that controlled their fates. The hollow rested within the Smoky Mountains like a quiet basin shielded from the world. The footpath leading in wound through thick trees and narrow ridges, discouraging casual travel. Those who visited described the silence there as unusual, a quiet shaped not only by distance but by intention. It was a place where people learned quickly not to ask unnecessary questions. A patchwork of surviving papers helps recreate the settlement as it once stood. Tax records show modest herds and small crop yields, hints of a family sustained by hard soil and limited land. Census takers listed the Vance names only sometimes, often without details that would explain the women behind them. Their ages shift in ways that suggest guesswork or reluctance from those answering the door. That combination of vague paperwork and steady disappearance creates the first shadows around the family's inner workings. Travelers' journals from the early 1900s add texture that official records fail to capture. One traveling minister wrote of arriving at the Hollow for a brief sermon only to find the women absent. The men he spoke with explained that the women preferred to stay inside during company. The minister noted this is unusual for the region where hospitality often served as social glue. In the Vance settlement, however, privacy held higher value than familiarity. Every account that mentions Granny Ma reinforces her position as the central figure. She acted as midwife, advisor, and enforcer of household rules. Neighbors from surrounding ridges recalled her as a stern woman who spoke decisively, rarely allowing others to finish a sentence. Children sent to fetch water or gather herbs by her instruction learned not to question her tone. These observations, though sparse, show a matriarch who blended respect, fear, and obligation into a single authority. That authority deepened through isolation. Without ready access to medical care, communities depended on midwives, granting them influence far beyond their role in childbirth. They managed remedies, attended emergencies, and often held the trust of entire households. In the Hollow, the dynamic intensified because no other trained hands were available. Granny Ma became the one person whose guidance was accepted without hesitation. This trust, once established, rarely left room for challenge. Women of the Vance family entered teenage years under her watchful eye. Memoirs collected from nearby towns mentioned that Vance girls seldom visited social gatherings and rarely stayed long when they did. Their departures were described as abrupt, sometimes escorted by an older relative. People assumed this guardedness was rooted in conservative upbringing. Yet the consistency with which young women withdrew hints at rules set behind closed doors. The social customs of the Smoky Mountains during that time already leaned toward privacy, but the Hollow reinforced it to an uncommon degree. Marriages were encouraged to remain within a close circle of neighboring homesteads. Travel was limited, especially during winter months when the path washed out. The isolation allowed one person's worldview to become the defining law of the settlement. Over time, these unwritten rules gained the weight of tradition. As historians reviewed these fragmented accounts, a subtle pattern emerged. The more closely a source described the Hollow, the more limited the women's lives appeared. Mentions of schooling were sparse. Visits to town were brief. Opportunities for independent decision-making dwindled with each generation. These details do not supply a complete picture, but they hint at a structure built around control rather than shared survival. By the time researchers put together all available testimonies, it became clear that the Hollow was not merely a secluded community. It was an environment where oversight faded and power concentrated around a single skilled, determined matriarch. That context sets the stage for what later discoveries revealed about the women who lived under her care and the fate that awaited each one as her 19th year approached. Our Vance entered the historical record quietly, appearing first in school lists from a small settlement near the Hollow. Unlike earlier generations whose childhood details were nearly invisible, she left traces that suggest a girl who wished to see more of the world beyond the narrow creek and weathered cabins. Her handwriting on a lesson copy saved in a local archive shows careful loops and deliberate strokes, signs of someone who worked to present her thoughts with order. She seemed determined to shape her own future, even while knowing the boundaries that surrounded her. Letters exchanged between two neighboring families provide the clearest picture of her early life. One letter writer mentions a young woman from the Hollow who visited during harvest season and helped with sewing while listening to stories about town markets. The writer notes that the girl appeared both eager and cautious, glancing toward the path as though expecting someone to call her back. Unknown to the letter writer, that girl was Ara. These glimpses reveal a person whose hopes pressed quietly against the expectations waiting for her in the Hollow. By the time she reached late teenage years, those expectations hardened into obligations. The unwritten rules that governed the Vance women centered on preparing them for motherhood long before they reached adulthood. Neighbors who spoke about the family mentioned that young women often disappeared from public view as their 19th year approached. For Ara, this time carried an even heavier weight because she knew the family history better than anyone. She had seen the gravestones of the women before her, all marked with the same brief span of life. It is no surprise that those approaching dates hovered over her with increasing intensity. What sets Ara's story apart from the generations before her is the evidence of reluctance. An acquaintance recalled a conversation where Ara admitted she wished for schooling beyond what the Hollow offered. The acquaintance described her voice as firm yet subdued, like someone who had already rehearsed her resignation. These remarks, saved in an interview decades later, suggest she hoped for change but felt the consequences of defying her grandmother would be too severe. The pregnancy that followed was viewed by outsiders as a sign that she had accepted the family's fate, though the surviving sources imply something more complex. A midwife from a neighboring ridge claimed that Ara visited once, asking general questions about childbirth and safety in remote areas. The midwife remembered her as anxious yet determined, grasping at any information that might help her survive what generations before her had not. This meeting, though brief, stands as a rare moment when a Vance woman sought knowledge without Granny Ma's approval. It hints at a growing awareness that she could not rely solely on tradition. As the winter of her final year approached, weather reports confirm a long stretch of storms that repeatedly threatened the path leading into the Hollow. One neighbor wrote that she saw Ara only twice during those months, each time appearing thinner and quieter as though saving strength. The writer wondered whether Ara was battling illness or fear, though she felt it improper to ask. These fragments create a sense of tightening atmosphere around the young woman, as though the mountains themselves were closing in. Behind the scenes, however, Ara was preparing in her own limited way. The journal later found beneath the floorboards of the birthing cabin recorded her attempts to hide items she believed might help her during labor. Strips of cloth, herbs gathered during summer, and notes copied from the midwife she secretly visited. The entries never describe why she hid them. Instead, they contain brief reflections on hope, survival, and the desire to raise her child away from the Hollow's rigid expectations. Her words reveal a clarity of mind uncommon for someone living under such pressure. By the time spring storms threatened the mountain passes, Ara's pregnancy was nearing its end. Those who saw her described her as focused, almost resolute, no longer displaying the hesitation she had carried in earlier years. She understood the dangers that awaited her and recognized that her grandmother held more influence over the birth than anyone else. Yet the preparations noted in her journal show she had not surrendered. She was ready to challenge the fate that had claimed every woman of her bloodline. This chapter in the investigation marks a turning point because Ara Vance did not simply accept the pattern. She understood it, questioned it, and sought knowledge beyond the hollow. Her actions created the first visible crack in a structure that had endured for generations. The circumstances surrounding her final days bring us closer to the hidden truths buried beneath the birthing cabin's floorboards and the matriarch who oversaw every life that entered the world there. The journal discovered beneath the birthing cabin floorboards stands as one of the few personal documents produced by a Vance woman. Its pages were softened by moisture and time, yet enough remained readable to offer an intimate view of daily life inside the hollow. The handwriting varied in firmness, as though written during moments of both calm and urgency. No name appears in the entries, but context suggests the writer lived at least a generation before Ara. Her words bridge the gap between sparse public records and the unspoken rules that shaped every aspect of the family's private world. The earliest surviving entry describes a sense of confinement rather than hardship. The writer mentions the hollow's isolation in practical terms, noting the difficulty of reaching neighboring cabins during heavy rains. Yet beneath those observations lies an emotional tone hinting at something deeper. She writes of feeling watched even when alone, explaining that certain tasks had to be completed in specific ways to avoid displeasing the matriarch. The entry avoids direct accusation but implies that household routines were enforced with remarkable strictness. As the entries progress, a pattern emerges. The writer repeatedly references instructions given by Grandma regarding preparation for childbirth. These notes appear as lists of tasks and reminders, showing a household where the process was rehearsed well before any woman approached labor. Though nothing explicitly describes harm, the precision with which these steps were recorded feels more ceremonial than medical. The writer expressed unease about the expectations placed upon her, hinting that questioning those instructions was quietly discouraged. One entry talks about a whispering conversation between two younger women in the household. They spoke about the births of relatives who had not survived, lowering their voices for fear that Ma might overhear. The writer does not record the full details, only her own reaction. She wrote that the women believed their mothers had suffered more than the official explanation suggested. She did not describe the events themselves, focusing instead on the fear that discussing them might lead to punishment. That moment stands as one of the clearest suggestions that the family story differed significantly from official records. The journal also mentions a locked chest kept in a corner of the birthing room. Its contents were never described, but the writer noted that Ma alone possessed the key. She mentioned hearing the chest being opened late at night and closing again with a metallic click. The writer wondered whether the chest contained medicines or tools, though she seemed uncertain. The entries offer no answer to this question, leaving modern readers to guess about the chest's significance. Late in the journal, the tone shifts from observation to worry. The writer comments that her own 19th year approached, and that Ma had begun paying closer attention to her. She described moments when the matriarch looked at her without speaking, as though judging her readiness. The writer's sense of dread grows in each entry, not tied to the idea of childbirth itself, but to the ritual surrounding it. She noted that the birthing cabin felt cold even in summer, and she avoided stepping inside unless instructed. The final surviving entry is brief and hurried. The writer states that she has hidden the journal beneath the floorboards because she fears it might be found. She wrote not out of defiance but out of a desire to preserve a piece of truth for someone in the future who might understand. She ends by saying she hopes the next woman in the family will have the strength to ask the questions she could not. Researchers studying the journal noted its significance as an intimate record of life under a single authoritative figure. While the entries remain careful and restrained, they reveal a climate of control and unspoken rules that shape the experiences of every Vance woman. The writer's uncertainty, her need to hide her reflections, and her quiet hope for a different future provide crucial insight into what later confronted Ara. The discovery of this journal did not answer every question about the family, but it illuminated the emotional landscape of a woman who lived under the same expectations that eventually confronted Ara. The hidden pages cast new light on the Hollow's history and set the stage for the revelations that would emerge when Ara faced her own turning point inside that very same cabin. Granny Ma's authority was never recorded in official minutes, yet her presence fills nearly every surviving account from the Hollow. Church visitors, county clerks, and neighboring farmers described a woman who combined practical skill with strong certainty. She delivered infants, tended fevers, and kept herbal remedies. People trusted her ability. They also sensed that her work was guided by a belief system that reached beyond simple midwifery and into the governance of family life itself. Contemporary notes and fragments from the hidden journal sketch the outlines of that belief. Ma is shown as someone who viewed motherhood not merely as a social role, but as a boundary that, once crossed, changed a woman's place in the household. The journal records a phrase repeated by Ma in quiet, insistently practical tones. She spoke of vessels that, once emptied and filled again, required special handling. The writer, careful and fearful, recorded the phrase without comment. The language reads like instruction rather than comfort. Neighbors remembered rituals that now read as symbolic enforcement. Newborns were introduced into the household under Ma's supervision and received names she approved. Mothers were expected to follow a set sequence of rest, diet, and movement. The rules might have been offered as protective measures in a place where infections and complications were common. Yet the repetition and rigidity of those practices, documented across decades, gave them a weight beyond health advice. They became the code by which the hollow operated. The closest thing to an official record of Mai's methods came in the form of receipts and a list of purchased supplies found in a trunk where she kept her herbs. Bottles, bandages, scissors, and saw files appear among entries for ointments and linens. A visiting midwife from a neighboring ridge later wrote that she had seen some of Mai's tools when she assisted during a difficult delivery years earlier. The visiting midwife described them as unremarkable for the region, ordinary instruments for a woman who had practiced for decades. Those practical details do not clarify motive, but they do confirm that Ma kept tools at hand, and that she practiced with an efficiency that neighbors respected. Beyond tools and lists, testimonies reveal how Ma maintained control. She gave advice in public and private, correcting younger women with a tone that left little room for debate. When disputes arose between families, people said she often stepped in, not as a healer but as judge. Her word carried legal force where courts were distant. That concentration of social power allowed practices to continue without outside scrutiny. In such environments, the difference between custom and coercion can blur. The hidden chest mentioned in earlier entries belongs to this pattern of guarded authority. Witnesses who later searched the birthing cabin after the hollow emptied described a locked container, and the absence of logs explaining its contents. The existence of a sealed container kept the boundaries between town knowledge and household secrecy intact. Ma controlled access to information and instruments alike. That combination amplified her influence and stifled questions. Importantly, sources never present Ma as a caricature of cruelty. She is, in surviving accounts, a skilled practitioner and a forceful personality. Many neighbors expressed gratitude for her help in times of emergency and acknowledged that in a remote region, she likely saved lives. Yet the same sources also note the pattern of sudden departures and the hush surrounding childbirth outcomes. When practical care intersects with a rigid doctrine about what should follow a birth, the moral and ethical stakes change. Scholars who examined these materials framed Ma's doctrine as both cultural product and personal conviction. In a hollow where medical knowledge was scarce and patriarchal structures limited options for young women, a single figure could shape the terms of life and death without challenge. Ma's teachings, enforced through routine and control of knowledge, created a closed system. Within that system, the fate of mothers became less a matter of chance and more the result of set practice. This chapter leaves us with an image of a woman whose skill and conviction made her indispensable and simultaneously dangerously unaccountable. The documents do not claim to prove intent. They do show how a singular worldview, tightly held and long practiced, could determine the outcomes for an entire line of women. The next stage of the investigation moves from doctrine to the night when those teachings were tested and when the hollow's secrets finally collided with the storm. Weather reports saved in regional archives describe the early spring storms that struck the Smoky Mountains during the year Ara approached childbirth. Heavy rainfall soaked the ridges for days, turning narrow paths into streams and filling the creek below the Vance cabins until its roar masked nearly every sound. Locals recalled that the ground felt unsteady beneath their feet, as if the mountains were shifting under the swollen weight of water. When the mud finally loosened, it blocked the only route into the hollow. Those who lived nearby realized quickly that anyone inside would be cut off until the land settled. Ara entered this period already strained. Letters from a neighboring family mentioned seeing her shortly before the storms began, noting her paleness and the way she held her arms close to her body as though bracing against more than cold. She had grown quieter in the final weeks. Yet her journal entries from that time reveal sharpened attention rather than resignation. She wrote about gathering stored cloth and preparing mixtures learned from the midwife she had secretly consulted. Those notes do not express dread. They show a young woman forming a plan. The storm changed the rhythm of life in the hollow. Without the possibility of outside help, every decision fell to Granny Ma, and she took charge swiftly. Witness accounts from neighbors who heard distant shouts on the night the mudslide hit describe a voice they believed belonged to Ara, followed by another voice they did not recognize. Later testimony suggests this may have been Ma calling instructions, though the words were lost beneath the thunder of the storm and the rush of the creek. Inside the birthing cabin, Ara faced the reality of her situation with an awareness none of her predecessors had possessed. The journal she found from an earlier generation had taught her that silence offered no safety. She sensed that the rituals imposed by her grandmother carried implications beyond tradition. Her own notes mentioned the way Ma watched her in the final days, measuring her strength without speaking, as though preparing for something predetermined. When the storms intensified, the cabin creaked under the pressure. The roof held firm, but the sound of shifting earth traveled beneath the floorboards where Ara had hidden what little she could use in an emergency. She labored in waves, gripping the items she had prepared, determined to maintain control over her body even as pain strengthened. She understood that Ma would step in soon, bringing out the familiar routine she had used for generations. Ara resolved to delay that moment for as long as she could. Accounts reconstructed from her later statement reveal that Ma moved through the cabin with practiced calm. She prepared linens and heated water, maintaining a pace that suggested she expected the delivery to unfold according to her established rules. Ara watched her grandmother retrieve tools from the locked chest, though she could not see their full details from where she lay. What mattered most to her in that moment was the realization that she needed to act before the process reached a point of no return. The storm, in a strange way, became an ally. Each tremor of the land disrupted the routine and drew Mai's attention away. At one point, a heavy branch struck the roof, sending a shudder through the cabin. Ara used that shift to reposition herself, forcing Ma to adjust her approach. These small interruptions gave Ara moments to breathe and assess. They also marked the first time in decades that the well-rehearsed birthing pattern faltered. Outside, the mountains continued to move. By dawn, the rain had lightened, but the mudslide remained firm across the path. Neighbors attempting to approach the hollow stopped when they saw the trees and stones blocking the route. No one could reach the cabin, and no one inside could call for help. The Vance family was entirely alone, suspended in a rare moment when nature disrupted the authority that had governed the hollow for generations. What unfolded during those hours would later be told only in partial detail by Ara. She described the birth as a struggle of will as much as of body. She refused to give up control and resisted Ma's attempts to direct her through the rigid steps dictated by tradition. She focused on the memory of the journal's final entry, the words urging a future woman to find strength where others could not. By the time the storm clouds thinned, the pattern that had ruled the family for generations was beginning to break. This moment inside the cabin marked the first real disruption of the cycle that had taken so many women before her. The next chapter shifts to what those outside the hollow discovered when the land finally allowed them to re-enter, and what signs remained of the struggle that had taken place. The sheriff and 3 volunteers made their way toward the hollow shortly after sunrise, stepping carefully over the remnants of the mudslide. The earth still felt unsettled beneath their boots, soft in places and firm in others, like ground deciding whether to hold or shift again. They moved slowly, clearing branches as they went, until the path finally opened onto the familiar clearing where the Vance cabin stood. The place looked unchanged at first glance. Yet the silence carried a different weight than before, as if the storm had taken something with it and left something else behind. The sheriff noted that the chimney still released a thin thread of smoke, suggesting someone had tended the fire recently. This eased his fear only briefly. Smoke meant life, but it did not reveal whose hands had fed the flames. As they approached the main cabin, a faint smell of damp timber and cooling hearth drifted into the air. Nothing seemed disturbed beyond what the storm had forced. Yet the absence of movement unsettled the group. The sheriff knocked on the cabin door and waited. No answer came. He pushed it open with deliberate caution, allowing the light to spill onto the floorboards. The first thing he noticed was the warmth inside. A fire still burned in the stove, though the wood smoldered more than it flamed. On a nearby table lay a bowl of water and several folded linens, suggesting someone had tried to maintain order despite the storm. The room itself showed signs of recent struggle, though nothing violent or chaotic. A chair had been moved from its usual corner, and a small crate sat on its side near the far wall. The sheriff stepped further in, calling for Ara and Ma. His voice echoed in the space without reply. The volunteers exchanged uneasy glances. They knew the family rarely welcomed outsiders, yet the silence bordered on unnatural. It was one of the volunteers who noticed the door to the birthing cabin slightly open. The sheriff approached it with restrained caution. The room behind it appeared dim despite the morning light, its single window streaked with mud from the storm. The bed near the center of the room looked recently used, blankets disheveled yet not abandoned in haste. A small cradle rested beside it, covered with cloth. The sheriff moved closer and called Ara's name. This time, a soft sound answered him, not loud enough to identify, but unmistakably human. He lifted the cloth from the cradle and found a newborn lying within, wrapped carefully and sleeping. Relief washed through the room. Whatever had happened, the child was alive and unharmed. But Ara was not in the birthing cabin. They found her in the next room, sitting near the cold wall with her knees drawn close. Her clothing was rumpled and her eyes carried exhaustion deeper than anything the storm alone could explain. When she looked up, the sheriff noted that she held herself protectively, as though guarding more than her own body. Ara whispered that she and the baby were safe. The sheriff asked about Ma. Ara did not answer at first. She glanced toward the far corner of the cabin where the locked chest usually sat, then back at the sheriff. Finally, she told him that Ma was gone. She said it quietly, as though repeating a truth she had only begun to accept. The volunteers searched the cabin and surrounding area, but there was no sign of the matriarch. No footprints marked the mud near the threshold. No supplies appeared missing. It was as if she had walked into the storm and vanished before dawn. The sheriff recorded that absence in his notes with visible unease, acknowledging that Ma's disappearance explained the tension in the hollow yet created 100 new questions. The sheriff prepared to escort Ara and the child out of the hollow, though the path remained partially blocked. Ara agreed, but her voice trembled when she asked how far they needed to travel. She looked back at the cabin once, eyes fixed on the empty space near the chest. She did not elaborate on what had happened during the night, offering only fragments about holding on, keeping the child close, and refusing to follow traditions that she believed placed her life at risk. As the group left the hollow, the sheriff sensed that the events inside the cabin extended beyond anything recorded in county history. The empty space where Ma should have been lingered in his thoughts. The storm had disrupted the mountain, but something in that house had disrupted the lineage that had followed the same pattern for generations. The disappearance marked the first true break in the cycle and the beginning of a deeper mystery he knew the records alone could not solve. Ara's statement to the district nurse became the most significant surviving account of what happened inside the hollow after the storm. It was not recorded immediately. She spent several days recovering in a neighbor's cabin far from the path that had trapped her during the birth. Only after she regained enough strength to speak did the nurse gently ask what had unfolded during the long night. Even then, Ara chose her words with restraint, as if weighing each one before letting it leave her mouth. Her statement begins with the moment the storm peaked. She recalled the sound of rushing water and the shifting earth beneath the cabin, vibrations that made the lantern flicker and sent dust drifting from the rafters. She said Ma continued working with unwavering determination, insisting on certain steps while ignoring the instability outside. Ara explained that she sensed something in her grandmother's manner she had not recognized before, a focused intensity that made the room feel smaller. She never described any violent act. Instead, she spoke of Ma preparing for a process she had learned through the journal and the midwife she consulted to fear. Ara said she recognized the tools her grandmother placed on the table, not because she had used them herself, but because she had seen them listed in an earlier woman's writings. She understood then that the old routines were not merely customs but something more deliberate, and she realized she would not survive if she surrendered control. According to the nurse's notes, Ara described the birth as a challenge shaped by two opposing wills. She kept her voice low while telling it, refusing to expand on details that caused visible strain. She said she concentrated on safe positions and techniques taught to her during the secret visit beyond the ridge. She used every moment of distraction the storm offered, shifting when Ma turned away or when the cabin shook. She believed those disruptions helped her keep a measure of independence until her child arrived. Once the baby was born, the nurse's record mentions a long pause in Ara's story. She eventually said Ma insisted on taking the child, claiming the mother needed to rest. Ara did not hand the infant over. She held the child tightly and told Ma she was strong enough to manage without help. The nurse wrote that Ara's tone shifted when describing this moment, becoming firmer and more certain, as though she had found her voice during the confrontation. Ara said Ma stood silently for a long time before turning toward the locked chest. When she opened it, the storm rattled the window so loudly that both women looked up. Ara used the moment to rise from the bed and move toward the next room. She did not explain how she managed it physically, only that instinct pushed her forward. When she reached the next room, she blocked herself in as best she could with a chair and held her child while listening for footsteps. The nurse wrote that Ara did not elaborate on what she heard next. She simply said that Ma did not follow her. After several minutes, Ara called out to her grandmother but received no answer. She waited until the storm softened before looking back into the main room. Ma was gone. The chest remained open. A lantern still burned beside it, flame steady and bright. Ara offered no theories about where her grandmother went. She said only that the storm created a moment in which Ma could have stepped outside without her noticing. The sheriff later searched for tracks but found none, the mud having shifted too many times to preserve any trail. The nurse's final note describes Ara as calm but deeply wary. She asked whether it was possible to leave the region quietly without drawing attention. She said she did not want anyone from the hollow to find her. The nurse assured her that arrangements could be made. This testimony marked a significant turning point in the investigation. It confirmed that Ara had actively resisted the rituals that shaped the lives of early Avance women. It also reinforced the unsettling mystery of Mai's disappearance, suggesting a departure timed with uncanny precision. The absence of clear evidence meant no formal inquiry followed, leaving the events of that night suspended between recorded fact and unanswered possibility. The sheriff's official report reached the county seat with a tone that mixed relief and unease. He described removing Ara and the infant from the hollow, cataloging the cabin's interior, and noting the absence of Granny Ma. Yet his pages reveal more than procedural facts. He recorded the way Ara held the child close and the closed posture she adopted when asked about the night. He wrote of the open chest and the lantern still burning beside it, small details that suggested the household had been interrupted rather than abandoned. Local newspapers carried a brief mention of the incident, framed as a weather story with human interest elements. The articles focused on the mudslide and the difficulty of travel, with only a paragraph acknowledging Ara's delivery and Ma's disappearance. The press treated the family pattern with polite distance, repeating the word complications where older records had used it. Reporters at the time lacked the archival context later historians would bring to the story. For the immediate community, the event was both a relief and a new kind of mystery. When Ara chose to leave the hollow, she chose a quiet relocation under an assumed surname. County clerks recorded an informal statement saying she wished to avoid attention. The documents show her intent to start life far from the ridge, but they don't reveal the details of how she planned to raise her child away from the hollow's reach. Neighbors who later encountered her described a woman who kept few possessions and spoke little of the past. She rarely mentioned Ma by name and refused to discuss the traditions that had governed her family. The sheriff continued limited inquiries for several months, but the mudslide and the scattered nature of mountain communities made thorough searches difficult. Tracks were erased and leads grew cold. Without direct evidence of wrongdoing or a body to find, legal authorities lacked grounds for a criminal case. The absence of proof turned a traumatic family history into a puzzle that official channels could not solve. Ma in the records existed as an absence whose implications were left to rumor and private guessing. Over time, the Vance Hollow became a quiet subject of local folklore. Stories about the matriarch circulated around hearths and at harvest suppers. Some framed her as a kind guardian who had acted to protect newborns in an unforgiving landscape. Others suspected a darker motive, insisting that her methods had cost mothers their lives and that she controlled the family by withholding options. Within these competing stories, the truth became layered and harder to extract. Decades later, historians revisiting the case put together the scattered documents and oral accounts into a more structured timeline. They relied on the hidden journal, the sheriff's notes, and Ara's statement to assemble a believable explanation. Their analysis emphasized social context, isolation, scarcity of medical care, and the extraordinary authority a single skilled practitioner could gain. Those conditions, they argued, allowed a doctrine to solidify into practice with deadly consequences. The historians stopped short of declaring legal guilt, instead framing the story as a warning about power left unchecked. Genealogists traced Ara's line through census records and baptismal entries that used her assumed surname. The child she saved lived into adulthood and raised a small family beyond the ridge. Descendants reported few stories about the Hollow and expressed a consistent desire to move beyond that history. When researchers contacted them, they received measured responses, gratitude that the events were being recorded, and a guarded wariness about delving too deeply into family lore. The open question of where Ma went persisted. Some suggested she left intentionally to avoid scrutiny. Others proposed she had perished in the mountains after walking away from the cabin. A few held the rumor that she had been taken by neighbors who feared her influence. None of these leads produced conclusive proof. The lack of closure allowed the Hollow story to remain unresolved in public memory. For investigators and storytellers, the case became a study in how social habit, authority, and isolation come together. The Vance Hollow shows that patterns which appear statistical can arise from human decisions practiced across time. The documents do not resolve every moral question. They do, however, compel reflection on how societies assign trust and to whom they grant unchecked power. As the story moved from local memory into archival study, the tone shifted from rumor to cautious analysis. The Hollow's legacy endured because the records preserved both the facts and the silences. Those silences, scholars often note, are as telling as the entries themselves. They point to the lives that could not speak and to the need for systems that protect the vulnerable when a single person holds so much power. The Hollow left its mark differently on each generation. For some, it became a wound they ignored. For others, it remained an unanswered question they carried like a cold stone. The last chapter of this investigation stitches those responses together to show how memory, record, and absence combined to shape a legacy both local and archival. In the years after Ara left the ridge, the region changed slowly. Roads improved and travel became less dangerous, allowing scholars and genealogists to visit places that had once required a full day on foot. When researchers came to the Hollow, they found the cabins weathered by time, but still arranged in the same pattern the sheriff described. The chest in the birthing room remained where Ma left it, its lock broken and its contents catalogued by officials who wished only to understand. Bottles of ointment, folded linens, handwritten notes, and a few ordinary tools filled the space. Nothing in the chest proved the worst suspicions, and yet everything inside fit into the story of a woman who managed births and controlled a household with careful attention. Public interpretations split along familiar lines. Some historians emphasized structural causes, arguing that the Hollow was an accident of geography, poverty, and the particular concentration of authority in a person with little oversight. They suggested the pattern of deaths resulted from limited medical options, combined with ritualized practice that discouraged outside knowledge. Others proposed a more troubling idea that within the context of isolation, a doctrine had hardened into deliberate action. Those scholars did not accuse without evidence, yet they insisted the archival record permitted only a narrow margin of innocence. Family descendants added another perspective. When contacted by researchers, they tended to draw a veil over specific details, preferring to frame the matter as a private tragedy rather than a public scandal. The child Ara saved lived and raised children of their own. Family members offered accounts of resilience and quiet rebuilding. They also expressed a desire to move beyond the Hollow shadow. Their position complicated the historian's task. True understanding required balancing empathy for survivors with rigorous questions about what had occurred. The case also entered discussions about rural power and the ethics of caregiving. Midwives, scholars of medical history, and ethicists used the Vance Hollow as an example of how vital knowledge can become dangerous when held exclusively by a single person without accountability. Training programs and community clinics that came later to address those gaps by expanding access to education and by creating norms for shared oversight. In that sense, the Hollow story informed reforms that aimed to make remote childbirth safer and more transparent. Despite those efforts, unanswered details persisted. Mai's absence remained a knot in the record. Theories multiplied. Voluntary exile, death in the mountains, or a departure to start anew where she could not be found. Each explanation had believability, and each invited its own ethical reading. If she left intentionally, it raised questions about conscience and guilt. if she vanished or died. The lack of testimony preserved doubt that denied definitive moral judgment. Ara's life after leaving the hollow offers the clearest form of resolution. She did not seek public attention. In private, she taught the child to read and to hold a pen steady, to value records that could speak where people could not. She lived long enough to see a different generation learn better practices and ask questions openly. Her decision to hide the earlier journal and later preserve details with a quiet hand shaped how scholars would interpret events. She refused spectacle and insisted that truth could be found in patient reconstruction rather than accusation. The hollow remains an object lesson. It shows how a pattern of deaths can be produced by social mechanics rather than supernatural fate. It shows how authority can harden into doctrine when communities lack external checks. And it reveals how courage can look like small acts of preservation and escape rather than public confrontation. There are still silences in the archive. A handful of names are missing from church lists. Some letters vanished or were burned. These gaps remind us that history is partial and that compassion must govern inquiry when victims cannot speak for themselves. If this difficult journey unsettled you, and you want more stories that look at quiet places of the past, press like and subscribe. Liking helps the story reach someone who might remember a detail that changes everything. Subscribing brings you back when we follow the next hidden ledger and open the next sealed chest.